The city of Memphis faces an eviction crisis after a federal judge overturned the CDC's eviction moratorium. Also, are landlords the unforeseen victims of the eviction moratoriums? Finally, a North Carolina landlord worries that he is going to lose his house due to the eviction moratoriums there. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have a couple of interesting articles for you today, but before we get started, go ahead, hit that like and subscribe button, and that will help me make sure that I can bring more articles like these to you today. So the first article I have for you today comes out of Memphis, Tennessee, and recently a federal court there struck down the eviction moratorium. But let's get into this article. We can hear about a little bit more details. It says, Memphis faces an eviction crisis after court strikes down the federal ban. On paper, Americans who have fallen behind on the rent are protected from eviction until July after a federal order, but at least 3 courts have recently issued rulings effectively nixing the eviction protection, leaving renters around the U.S. a step closer to homelessness. Nowhere is this more evident than Memphis, Tennessee, according to legal experts and housing advocates. Local housing laws favor landlords over tenants, and while the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's moratorium and local restrictions temporarily slowed evictions, the federal court in the state's Western District ruled last month that the federal government likely exceeded its authority when it moved to halt evictions. I personally believe that, they did exceed their authority. They also didn't take into consideration the fact that a lot of landlords would not be able to financially handle a lot of non-paying tenants inside these properties. They supposedly put some rent relief into place so that landlords could get paid, but a lot of the times either the tenant or the landlord don't qualify, or there's some reason like government bureaucracy that the money hasn't been delivered to anybody. So landlords instead have to take the burden upon themselves with non-paying tenants, and with the thin profit margins that a lot of landlords have, that has been absolutely disastrous. So it's a good thing that the federal courts have stepped in there and said, hey, no more of this. This is beyond the authority of the CDC, because otherwise a lot of landlords would just be left out in the cold and wouldn't be able to get rid of these problem tenants. My other issue is that even with everything going on, we know a lot more about the disease than we did a year ago. We know that there are a lot of vaccines, etc., available. I think that these eviction moratoriums, they are outdated, okay? And we know that people can move and safely move even now with the virus still out there. So there's no reason for these eviction moratoriums to be happening. We need to go back to the standard that was before the pandemic. People can move and not have any risk of getting infected by this virus. This is completely ridiculous. Although the government plans to appeal the case, eviction filings in Shelby County, which contains Memphis, have risen rapidly. Housing advocates also worry the city is a bellwether of what could happen elsewhere around the U.S. as the federal moratorium and many local eviction bans expire. What we are seeing is exactly what we expected when the CDC's order would end. People who qualified for those protections, who had asserted those protections, were now being evicted, said Katie Ramsey Mason, an assistant professor at the University of Memphis School of Law. Eventually the moratoriums were going to end regardless, okay? Either the federal government or the local government or someone was going to end them, and then the evictions would be filed, okay? This is not going to prevent these people from being evicted. These people have to leave regardless of whether there's a moratorium or not. Eventually they're going to be forced to leave. Eventually landlords are going to be forced to file these evictions, and things will be forced to go back to normal. And what a lot of these housing advocates want is no evictions at all, ever, for any reason. And we can see just how disastrous that would be by just looking at places like Washington, D.C., where, I went over a story where they wouldn't even allow the eviction of violent tenants for a short period of time. And, fortunately they changed that law, but it's crazy just thinking about what could happen if these eviction moratoriums are extended indefinitely. Ramsey Mason runs the school's legal clinic, which typically handles healthcare issues, but which pivoted during the pandemic to also handle eviction cases. A lot of people are contacting us with the impression this moratorium will keep them housed, said Jeremiah Smith, an organizer with the Memphis Tenants Union. We've definitely seen an uptick in tenants who are telling us, hey, I'm being called into court. Yeah, I mean, that's the result. And instead of just saying, hey, you need to be looking for alternative housing, you need to figure out another plan, or you need to pay your landlord. They're trying to force the landlords basically to take the financial burden onto themselves. And I don't agree with that. Angelic Kathy, who rents a 2-bedroom in South Memphis, had her first eviction hearing Friday, 6 months after her landlord filed eviction papers. The 29-year-old left her restaurant job last year after repeated closings and reopenings during the pandemic disrupted her earnings. She now earns $7.25 an hour working full-time at McDonald's. Kathy lives with her fiancé, who lost his job at a country club last year when the pandemic took hold, and who now does odd jobs when he can find them. Also living with her are her 3 sons, aged 10, 8, and 5. Her duplex was sold in June, and while Kathy initially got along with her new landlord, she soon stopped paying her $400 monthly rent because the landlord wasn't making required repairs, Kathy told CBS Money Watch. Her home was often without heat and didn't have a working oven. Kathy said instead of rent, she used her wages and federal stimulus money to pay for utilities so her sons could attend school remotely and on taking her kids out to eat, saying she didn't have a working oven or a stove. So there you go right there, okay? So she's fully employed. Her fiance, her, man who lives with her is essentially unemployed, not making any money. She only pays $400 a month. And I admit, when you're only making $7.25 an hour at McDonald's, $400 a month is a lot of money. However, when you see that, she's taking her kids out to eat all the time, she used all of her stimulus money to, buy other stuff, not to pay her landlord, not to pay her rent. She used her stimulus money to buy other stuff. And believe me, when you have 3 kids and you're a single mom, you are probably getting thousands upon thousands of dollars in this stimulus checks, okay? So her financial, her mistakes financially are no reason for her not to pay her landlord. She thought that paying her utility bill was super important because she knew, if they cut off the electricity or the water, then she won't have a livable home. But at the same time, she didn't think enough about her landlord to say, oh yeah, my landlord can take my entire home away from me. So now she's going to suffer the consequences of that, okay? And I don't blame the landlord for filing eviction on her. There's no reason why somebody who received thousands of dollars worth of stimulus couldn't pay you anything. And it's hilarious seeing this article even make excuses for this lady. Okay, so the next article I have for you comes from influensive.com, and it says, Landlords and Investors, the Unforeseen Victims of the Eviction Moratorium. Yeah. Article after article after article that I've brought to you have said the same thing. That landlords are suffering through the eviction moratoriums, that a lot of them are facing bankruptcy, are facing credit issues, could possibly lose their properties, and all of this so that we can pay so other people can live for free in our properties. And that's just not the way it should be done, okay? So let's get into this article. When the COVID-19 pandemic left Los Angeles working individuals and families unable to pay their rent, eviction moratoriums were issued on a state and federal level. This may have provided temporary relief to individuals struggling to make ends meet, but one key stakeholder was carelessly overlooked: landlords. According to Glenn Schur, co-founder of the LAAA team of Marcus and Millichap, most people have misconceptions about Los Angeles landlords. I think people falsely assume that these landlords are ultra-rich billionaires who can endure not having rental income for a few months. But that is actually not the case. A lot of these landlords are mom and pop owners who depend on their tenants paying their rent to survive. And that exactly is the case. A lot of landlords, even in Los Angeles, are mom and pop owners. They might own 1, maybe 2 properties, and it might have been a home that they used to live in that they just kept, and they decided to rent it out instead, and now they're stuck with a tenant who isn't paying. They still have a mortgage to pay. They still might have to pay utilities. They still have property taxes to pay. They still have insurance to pay. They still have to provide maintenance for the tenant living in their property and not paying rent. And they receive no income whatsoever from that property. So the impression that these landlords are super rich, that's just not true. And even I've even heard stories, well, why don't you just sell the property? Well, the thing is, especially when it comes to real estate investing, other investors do not want to buy a property with a non-paying tenant sitting in it because it's a money suck. You know, it just sucks your money from your pocket and you have no way to recoup that money until you can get rid of that tenant. So that's why a lot of these properties are pretty much unsellable even right now. So if you are able to sell it, you might take a huge loss, you know, like I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in the case of some properties, maybe even more on larger ones. So yeah, this is not the kind of situation that any landlord wants to be in. And it really is a situation that is punishing, especially the mom and pop landlords. Though generous pardons have been given to the tenants, the landlords have not been afforded the same special treatment, and the Los Angeles market has felt the consequences. As the most active multifamily apartment team in Los Angeles County, commercial real estate brokers Glenn Schur and Philip Nicolette specialize in 5+ unit commercial apartment buildings. They had a front row seat to the dumpster fire that ensued when tenants stopped paying rent. Landlords were left scrambling, unable to meet their mortgage and loan payments when the rent checks stopped coming in, recalls Nicolette. As panic ensued, Nicolette and Schur's support was more pertinent than ever. Many owners were forced to sell, but the circumstances were less than ideal. Just because they had to sell suddenly didn't mean they shouldn't get the best possible deal for the property, said Schur. Yeah, and you know, the landlords who were forced to sell, you know, many of them, they took a significant loss, especially if they bought recently before the pandemic began. You know, it's likely that they didn't make any money at all. They actually took a loss trying to get rid of this property, and they had to sell to wealthier investors, a lot of them being corporate investors who have the money and the funds to last out through this thing a little bit longer. And, you know, when you have a lot of corporate investors in an area, you'll notice that there isn't a lot of affordable housing because those corporate investors are at the beck and call of their investors, okay? They have people who invest in their companies and they demand that there's profits, and so they push rents as high as they can. So in a lot of cases, a lot of the naturally occurring affordable housing will just disappear when it's sold to these investors who, you know, work for corporate America. All right, so the final article I have for you today comes out of Greensboro, North Carolina. And it says, I'm going to lose the house. Frustrated Greensboro landlord laments unpaid rent, eviction moratorium. So a lot of landlords are especially worried that, you know, with all the financial issues and everything that's going on now, that they're actually going to lose their properties due to these eviction moratoriums. So let's get into this article and see what it has to say. The federal eviction moratorium, which ends at the end of June, was put in place to help renters from being evicted from their homes during the pandemic. But some landlords have said they have also lost their livelihood in the process, and in many cases are unable to give a timely reprieve. You can't sell your house. You can't rent it. You can't do anything with it, and nobody will come to your aid. I haven't had any luck with anybody so far, said one Greensboro landlord. This landlord, who didn't want to be identified for fear of reprisal, said his tenant owes 7 months of rent. According to him, the tenant has refused to pay any money towards the debt down. Yeah, that's the case for a lot of landlords right now. They have tenants in place who refuse to pay any money, won't talk to them, won't make arrangements to pay back any of the money. They know they can't be evicted, and they are not going to make any efforts to do anything until they are forced out of those properties, okay? I realize that there are a lot of people going around right now who are in financial distress. My only issue is that we are going back to unemployment that is at pre-pandemic rates. Also, there have been a lot of information that we've gotten about the virus, etc., where a CDC eviction moratorium doesn't even make sense anymore, especially with the number of people that are vaccinated, rates declining across the country, and things opening back up and returning to normal. Yet landlords are continuing to not get paid, and bad tenants are continuing to be protected from eviction. And that's just not the way this should be done. They had both hoped the HOPE program would cover it, but was denied due to lack of program funds, the landlord said. He added that weeks later, after several inquiries, an agent from the program called to say a check was in the mail. They would say a check is in the mail. Well, it's been 4 months and no money, and there's no money whatsoever from anybody, he said. So you expect to get some money in stimulus. You know, you fill out all the applications and everything, and guess what? They never send it. There's no funds to send to you. And you're forced to just continue to pay all your bills like nothing has changed and keep that tenant in your property. Meanwhile, you know, there's no relief whatsoever. You can't evict this person. When he saw that he would not make progress, the landlord said he decided to turn to the court. A Guilford County court issued a writ of possession and gave the sheriff's office authority to remove the tenant. However, with the federal moratorium on evictions extended, the sheriff's deputies can't act on it yet. It's going to end, I think, June 30th, but if it's extended, I'm going to lose the house, and I shouldn't have to, the man said as he fought back his emotion. Here I am trying to provide a home to somebody who needs it, and they have used the system not to pay anything and to stay there indefinitely. It's very frustrating and very unjust. It's not justice, he said. Yeah, this guy shouldn't lose his house, okay? That's just not the way that this is meant to be. You know, when they put these eviction moratoriums in place, did they imagine that, people will be forced to, they will lose their homes over it. You know, they will be forced into bankruptcy. You know, I don't think that a lot of politicians thought through a lot of the stuff that went through during the pandemic. I mean, we've seen restaurant owners that, were forced out of business. They had, they had beautiful businesses that had existed for 20, 30 years sometimes. And, they completely shut down indoor dining and gave these landlords no relief, and they were just forced out of business. And then we've seen things like the cruise lines where they're forced out of business for over a year with no relief, losing billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people out of their jobs. And now we also see landlords, and we're forced to provide free housing. And, the government puts this stuff into place. Politicians put this stuff into place, and they don't think about the implications of what they're doing.
March, the coronavirus shut down the city and evictions were put on hold. Now Pantano says he's out $50,000, the income he desperately needs to live.
That cost gets passed on to all the good tenants, all the folks that actually pay their bills. And that's not fair to them.
A rental property just left in ruins. And one landlord says he could only stand by and watch all of that happen. He says it's all thanks to the eviction moratorium.
Fear Street in New Haven, according to the landlord, the tenant who lives in this unit has not paid rent since the pandemic began.
Get anything for 3 months. That was okay. We could deal with it. But now it's gone a year, and I'm taking money out of our living expenses.
Can't do anything about it. $3,800 is a lot of money to me. I have to borrow money from people.
The CDC
to St. Louis City Sheriff Vernon Betts. His office is operating under an eviction moratorium extended by the presiding judge. That means he can't serve eviction notices. But for the first time since I've talked to him about this issue, he says landlords are indeed getting a bad deal.